Welcome to Improving Our Classrooms Webinar 3, Data-Informed Self-Evaluation at Classroom Level and Evaluative Writing, a Journal Approach. The webinar today is broken down into 3 sections. So firstly, I'm going to take you through the difference between being collegiate or being collaborative. And then Geraldine is going to have a look at data-informed self-evaluation at classroom level with you and really get you to start thinking about the data that's available to you to make sure that you're raising attainment in your classrooms. And then finally, Ailsa is going to have a look at evaluative writing, and you're going to start to form your research question, which is really important for you to do this before you start on your case study of improvement. So, collegiate or collaborative, what's the difference? And we want to look into this in some detail so that you've got a really good understanding when you're using these terms. Okay, collegiate or collaborative, and we've spoken to you about this in the pre-webinar discussion, and it's so important that we know the difference between both of these terms, and both of them are definitely not identical. So some of you got this absolutely right, and collaboration is a descriptive term referring to the cooperative actions of people, so staff working together. Collegiality refers to the quality of relationships among staff members in a school. So everybody's happy, there's a good ethos and a good relationships and a good atmosphere in the school. Being collegiate is also about that shared responsibility, so about everybody believing that it's shared equally and that things are fair in terms of the school. And a good example of that is the working time agreement. So that is an agreement between the staff, the amount of time that's spent on forward planning, the amount of time that's spent on reporting to parents, the amount of time that's spent on school improvement planning working parties. So that's a responsibility that everybody has a part of, that everybody is involved in, and everybody's happy with that, and relationships are good, and there's a good quality of discussion that goes on around that. But collaboration is different, because collaboration is that step further, and collaboration is about everybody working together towards this common goal. And in terms of our schools, that's about that continual school improvement and raising attainment and achievement for all children. So that's knowing where your children came from before they got to your class and knowing where they're going to go afterwards. So the difference about collaboration is it's about asking those challenging questions, it's digging deeper and really having real trust with your colleagues and knowing that you all have that common goal and you need to work together across that 3 to 18 curriculum that we spoke about when we spoke about the refresh curriculum to make sure our children get to that end goal when they leave school and into a really positive destination where they're going to succeed in the 4 capacities and contribute really well to school life. So we want you to have a think about the difference between these and really understand the difference between these 2 terms. It's important to mention the West Partnership because it's the West Partnership that have brought us all together in improving our classrooms. And in improving our classrooms, we're very proud to say that teachers do work collaboratively for that common goal of improvement and raising attainment and achievement for our young people. So it wasn't an easy task, and I know it took a considerable amount of time for the West Partnership to come up with a definition, but our definition as a regional improvement collaborative is: collaboration involves working together to understand and improve pedagogy for agreed purposes, which leads to better outcomes, informed by evidence and critical self-reflection. Very clear that it's about working together, and it's all about all the local authorities within our regional improvement collaborative that come together to make sure that we're learning from the skills and talents of each other and that we are working together, driving forward new policies, researching, so that we can provide the best quality of education for the young people in the West Partnership. You'll see here that if you look at the dictionary definition of collaboration, that it's simply 2 or more people working together but the important thing is to create or achieve the same thing. So it's that working together as part of a team, that trust, that inspiration, that challenge, that success, that exchange of ideas to actually work together with that same goal. Now, what we're going to ask you to do in your journal this week is to have a think about whether your school truly is collaborative. So is it just collegiate, that everybody gets on and everybody's is happy and everybody's doing their share of things, but in their own boxes and, and not outreaching into the school as a wider, entity, and that we're thinking about improvement and that journey, as we said, in the curriculum of 3 to 18, and everybody get that common goal for those end destinations for our young people. So what we want you to think about is providing some examples of what makes a difference in your school? What are the elements of your school that do make it truly collaborative? And we want you to share that with your trio before next week. Another thing we want you to do is we want you to ask 3 members of staff in your school to describe what makes your school collaborative. And we want you to make sure that you have got 1 member of SLT in those 3 people that you speak to. So we want you to think about that, and we're going to do a bit of discussion about this when we come back at the next webinar, because we really do need to understand the duty that we've got, that it is imperative for us to be working collaboratively with other professionals to make sure that we work together with that same goal and to achieve that same thing. And in an education sense, that is the best for all the children in our care, and raise attainment and achievement and have that school improvement, making sure that Scotland is the very best place to learn, and we really are fulfilling our duty to make sure that the children are confident in those 4 capacities as they move forward in life. We want to look a wee bit deeper here, and that move from being collegiate to being collaborative. So if you're in a school where team members work well constructively and everybody gets along, there's a focus on teaching and people are committed to their CLPL, but maybe it's a focus on individual classrooms and not reaching out and visiting other people's classrooms, then we need to think about how we can take it a step further. So you'll see in the middle there, we've got in red the use of data. And this really is the way that we can drive our schools to be truly collaborative. And we know when we have the collaborative school that that's when we're going to make a difference to learning and teaching and school improvement and for the outcomes for our young people. So when you use your data to see how to move learning and teaching forward, you become much more collaborative, because staff are asking difficult questions about learning and teaching. You're really challenging things of one another. You're thinking about the impact. It's not just about what you're teaching and what children are learning, but it's about what difference is that actually making. So you're taking that real ownership for young people in terms of their learner. And one of my favourite terms on this slide here is that leaders are leading learners and learning leaders. So you're really challenging one another's thinking, you're using the research, you're learning from one another, and that is what's going to take you from being collegiate to being a collaborative school, which we know is going to make a really big difference to the young people in our classes and wider schools. So why collaboration? And you'll have noticed in the last slide that it talked about imposter syndrome and that feeling we get when we really don't believe in ourselves and we don't think we're good enough. But what you need to remember is, and we'll tell you this probably in every webinar, that high quality teachers and you are our most precious resource. And that collective thinking of all of you together and really working together in a non-threatening, trusting environment will produce better ideas, more innovation and higher levels of success for our children. So we're going to move on now to using data and see how we can do this to lead to improvement in your classrooms. Okay, over to you now, Geraldine, for a really detailed look at data-informed self-evaluation at classroom level.
Thanks, Louise. And it's really clear that if we want to be truly collaborative schools, how we use our data, particularly at classroom level, is key to that. So I'd like to take you through just how we can do that, and do that in an informed way that actually has the impact that we're looking for. Okay, so we begin at looking at evidence v data. Have you considered what these are, these terms that we use, again, day and daily? Are they one and the same thing? Is evidence completely different from data? How are we using them? Are we clear on what evidence is? So let's consider not that pile, that wheelbarrow of evidence that we sometimes fall into the trap of trying to gather. Let's be very clear on what it is. Now, the direct evidence has to come from the pupils themselves when they are given opportunities to show their knowledge, their skills and their understanding through forms of assessment. And of course that can be in many forms, in jotters, observations and classwork. But we're actually going to take you through just what those could be and the purposes for them. There are, of course, indirect evidence, including surveys, interviews, focus groups or self-assessment. And again, which category do they fall into in terms of evidence and data, and how effectively are we using these? And data should always help and inform us about pupils' learning and improving their learning. We cannot be doing data for data's sake, or to tick a box and to put children through rigorous and numerous assessments unless it's telling us something. Now, in actual fact, what we must be aware of is that these decisions that we make based on data are just a subset of evidence-based decision making. Okay, so be careful in how we're using that. Be careful with the data that we're doing. Is it evidence-based that's informing our decision making? Again, we will clarify all of this as we go through, because at the moment you will have in your webinar discussion will have given us a raft of different forms of data that you have at classroom level, all of those things that you consider evidence. But what we must do is look and have it carefully organised, and an ideal combination of that direct and indirect evidence that gives us that information that we need when we're considering how to improve children's learning. And that, I think, is where we all need a bit of guidance with, because unless we're aware of the different types, direct, indirect, and unless we know in a more formal way what that type of evidence and data is, then we will not be using it as effectively. We will not get that wide range and balance that we're looking for here. Again, it should be systematically collected. It shouldn't be something that is once a term or at the end of a term. We all know that your assessment can be day to day, it can be hour by hour, it can be minute by minute, but as long as it's well planned and organised, and I think the key here is the analysis of that. It makes it then reliable. But again, we're going to consider how we do all of those things and how effective we are at doing those things. So rather than use terms like direct and indirect evidence, we have to be clearer on the terms that we're using. And as I mentioned, you'll have had a list of and a wide range of data that you have available to you in your classroom, and it'll be an extensive list. And we also ask you to consider themes, and there were a wide range of themes. Some would have come under pupil work, some would have come under maybe like jotter work, some would have come under end of unit assessments. Some would also have been our more formal assessments like MALT or NGRT or PM benchmarking and so on. And you have mentioned all of those. However, there are only two types of data that we gather. And for you moving forward and understanding and managing your data in your classroom, And actually informing your case study of improvement, it's very important you understand the two terms that we have here in terms of one being quantitative and the other being qualitative. Not always easy to say. So our quantitative deals with numbers. Okay, you can imagine the kind of numbers that you crunch every day in your classroom. There are percentages. It can be 18 out of 24 of my children or on track, and even evaluative language like almost all, and we know the percentages that we're talking when we use that kind of language. So these are all things that we can measure from our diagnostic, our summative and our standardised assessment, and that's why this type of data can be measured. We do ask for that wealth and reliable, robust data in our classrooms to inform our self-evaluation, but it tells us a number. It tells us only a number. And we will move on and later in the webinar, we will look at why we can't have an over-reliance on the quantitative data. And a bit of self-reflection for yourselves will be that balance that we need to strike between that quantitative and qualitative data. Okay, so what is qualitative? It deals with descriptions. It deals with things that you know about your children. It deals with things that you know about your context, about your school. And we will explore this further when we look at what makes a high quality tracking conversation, when we're able to talk about qualitative data and we're able to share the descriptions of our children and what we know about them and what we know about them as learners, but not necessarily to be able to be measured. However, some qualitative data can be measured in terms of informing our interventions or where we have opportunities to progress children's learning. So for example, qualitative, an observation of you observing your children working collaboratively, we could perhaps measure that in terms of the time on task together, or how many times the children shared, or how many times the children took turns. But primarily, this is about things that you can see and not necessarily measure, but give you real key and quality information about your children's learning. Okay, in order to get that balance that we're looking for, to not be over-reliant on quantitative data entirely and all of the figures and the numbers, we again direct you to one of the key documents that we mentioned in webinar 1, How Good is Our School for, Higgios 4. It is key in supporting us in how we can become effective in our self-evaluation. And Ailsa will mention it again later on in the webinar when we're thinking about how we can self-evaluate our practice and be able to give those evaluative statements about our learners, and we call it classroom blueprint, if you like, or our Bible. I mean, we really can't emphasise enough the importance of this document at times like this when we are considering how we can use the data and use the evidence and use all that we have and all that we know about our children to truly self-evaluate to progress their learning. So this is a term that you will have heard many times, but key to return to again and take that time to truly understand what does that mean. Okay, so triangulation of evidence this process is there to ensure that there's a robust evidence base. We spoke about that evidence base being part of that the data, and it's a process then that we ask you to participate in to make sure what you have is robust. The key to this, and again, if you want to be a collaborative school, you want to be part of a collaborative team, the key is that it involves all school staff. All school staff. So again, as you're considering your case study for improvement, you'll have to think of how you can involve your colleagues, your stage partners, your support for learning workers, your senior leadership team, everyone involved in this process. Of course, the learners are key to this. And again, you have to think of the ways that they are involved in this triangulation of the evidence. And of course, partners and other stakeholders cannot be left out of this process. We have to gather their views. We have to ensure that we are including them. And we'll go through how we can do that. Okay, and what you're doing here by involving all of those people is that you're ensuring a shared understanding of the school's capacity for continuous improvement. And as Louise has shown us, to be a truly collaborative school, you have to take part in processes like this and involve all of those people that I have just mentioned to gain that shared understanding. So, quantitative data, you know, we've touched on it briefly. It's about attainment, it's about the numbers, it's about attendance. However, unless you are effective in self-evaluation, and in fact self-evaluation of those forms of data, unless you're rigorous around that, unless you are interrogating that data, unless you are data literate, then you will not respond effectively when interventions are required. And again, we'll talk about that further on in the webinar about how you can do that. How can you interrogate the data effectively? It's not just sitting back and accepting those numbers and percentages. People's views, regularly seek opportunities to gather the views and the opinions and the ideas and the suggestions of staff and pupils and partners and those stakeholders that we previously mentioned. That is key, absolutely key. And again, when you're looking at your case study for improvement, we absolutely insist that you gather that kind of data, that features somewhere, because again, it will not be truly effective data at gathering of evidence unless it has that key element included. And that can be focus groups, surveys, professional dialogue, again, collaborative school if you're engaging in those conversations, learning conversations, questionnaires to that whole cohort of people that we're mentioning here. And of course, direct observations, also key. And look for them in a range of learning contexts. Plan for them. Have a criteria for them. If you are observing children working collaboratively, or if you're observing children perhaps in their active learning and how they're transferring skills, be clear on what it is that you're observing. And then be clear on the skills that you're looking for to gather the information and the knowledge about your children in this way. So there's 3 key areas there that make up our triangulation of evidence. And what you notice, what we can see quite clearly, that there is only one element there that we can see is quantitative, and those others, people's views and direct observations, are what we would describe as qualitative, where we get the quality in the range of evidence that we're gathering. So now, knowing that we have only those 2 key areas of data to consider, we now ask that you go back to that list as we suggested and ask yourself, are you using a wide range of data in your classroom? Sort it into quantitative and qualitative, again, not easy to say. However, what we expect to see and what we have witnessed over many cohorts in IOC is that there is an imbalance. There is an over-reliance in quantitative data. And that could perhaps be a result of our drive, our thirst, if you like, for those figures, for those numbers, for that high level message around where we are in terms of attainment. But again, as I'll say it again, if we are over reliant on that, then we are not getting that evidence-based data that we need. There has to be a balance of qualitative. And we ask you now to consider some of the things we've mentioned, again at the triangulation, of other ways we can gather that information, and are they informing your practice and how you progress children's learning. And we'll pick this up as part of the discussion in our next webinar. I want you to consider this quote, because now we're starting to think about our tracking conversations and where data plays its part in those tracking conversations, and the type of tracking conversations that you've been part of. Again, we are thinking as a collaborative school, our tracking meetings have to be much, much more than that number, much more than just the data. Data is just data. It will be a brick wall. It will take you no further unless we have the story, unless we have the interrogation, and that interrogation gives you the story. And you are duty bound to tell that story of your children, of that data, of what that means in terms of your role, their role, stakeholders' role in progressing their learning, and any interventions that we need to consider for them. Okay, so what we're saying here is we don't want to focus on the number. If you've been part of tracking conversations that just focus on, 65% of my children are on track for reading, 68% are on track for numeracy, and that's where the conversation ends, then they're ineffective and in effect useless. We have to keep, what we like to say in IOC is, we like to keep the faces on the data. Never lose sight of the children, and that's why their stories have to be told. And how we can make that shift is when we start to consider the story. And we'll take you through now what we would ask you to do in terms of looking and interrogating that data in a very specific manner. Okay, so what we're asking you to do now is to take perhaps a very different approach to looking at data to lead to improvement. We ask you to take a fact, story, action approach, and some of you may have heard this approach before, kind of akin to a thinking routine. I see, I think, I wonder, and it just breaks down the conversations that we must have as part of professional dialogue and as part of our tracking conversations. So we start off very much with the facts, okay? That's the quantitative element there. We say, okay, what's the data telling us? What are the high-level messages from the data? Okay, so there will be questions. The facts, the basic facts are primary 5 class, primary 4 class, 28 children, 15 boys, 13 girls. Those are the key points that we start off with, okay? And then we move on to things that are a wee bit more in detail, where we start to do that interrogation that we're asking for. First of all, we always ask who is on track and who is off track. Now, there could be different approaches that you take at that point of the conversation, but initially you are either on track or off track. And until our tracking conversation has an intervention in place for those children that are off track, they remain off track. However, with that intervention, they can, with that support, become on track. But our starting point is that either on track or off track. We ask you then to consider, so you have perhaps then the gender, perhaps there's a gender imbalance in your class where you have 10 girls and 20 boys. That focuses your thinking straight away. If you're in a class with 84% SIMD, that's a different focus, a different approach than if your class has 13% SIMD. Equally, EAL, if you have 3%, if you have only 2 children in your class with any kind of ASN support required. It focuses your thinking and you approach your classroom in a very, very different way depending on these things. And we ask you to look through these lenses initially to get that better understanding of your class. We do look at percentages. We do because they give us high-level messages. They do tell us things. If you're going into a classroom and you perhaps have 99% of your children on track for reading, that's a very, very different planning requirement there if you're a teacher and you're in your classroom and you've 45% of your children on track for reading. So those percentages just make us sit up and be more aware of our class and our class context. Because again, back to Haggeus 4, our Bible, it does ask us to look inward first of all. So we're looking inward, and that's all that it's going to tell us there. However, again, in true Haggeus 4 style, we do have to look outwards. And we ask that you do that. So where is my class sitting in terms of attainment and according to local and national data? So we all have that information around local. We all, in fact, we can even compare ourselves class by class. Two primary sixes will perhaps not have the same challenges and barriers to learning, even though they're two primary six classes in the same school. Look locally. We have comparator schools, and all of our authorities have. Glasgow has its focus toolkit, and this is something we ask you to become familiar with. East Wren, you have your tracking database. Eastern Bartonshire is the Tableau. It's the school information dashboard for primary schools that we'd be asking you to look at. And both Southland and Inverclyde have the BGE dashboard. We ask you to look at that. It's important that you are aware of where your children are sitting in terms of the national expectation, in terms of those percentages again that are really, really interesting reading about where you're faring in terms of local and national. You will always have comparator schools, and again we look and see what are they doing that perhaps we're not, and that's where we do ask you to ask those questions. It's okay having all of this information, having all of these facts, but again, all we're doing at this point is establishing where we are with our children, where we are with their classes, and this is the first stage of our learning conversation. Okay, we're focusing just on the facts only. So now we look at the story and the story behind the data. So the story behind the data is around those facts that we first considered, the number of boys in your class, the number of girls, SIMD, all of those things. We start to then even ask questions around my stage compared to my stage partner, my primary six class compared to the next primary six class. What's the story? The story will be different. We ask you to look at and find the gaps in your class. Now the data will start to tell us the gaps, but the story is the interpretation of that. So when you are looking at the data and you're looking at your summative and your diagnostic and your standardised assessments, they will start to tell you stories. From those tests you will get, those assessments rather, you will get the story of even your school. So as a school there perhaps may be a gap in terms of the children's understanding of number. As a school there may be a gap in terms of children's use of punctuation in their writing. It could be in terms of reading that there's a gap as a school in comprehension. Does your class buck that trend or mirror that trend? That's the story you tell from interpreting the data. When we look at the children who are not on track, we have to look at their barriers to their learning and look and see these children are not on track. Look through that lens. What is the makeup of those children that are not on track? Because when you do then approach this learning and tracking conversation about learning, those things are key in considering how you will support them and have an intervention in place. So in terms of your experience in a school where perhaps your children are 84% SIMD in your class, then that's a very, very different approach to a teacher that's going into a class with 13% SIMD and considering where their barriers are to their learning. Again, EAL children, the makeup of them, but again, EAL children that are performing particularly well. We have to consider what we're doing right for those children that we can use to support our other children. All of those things must be considered. There's stories around attendance that you have to consider and take into account as part of the story behind the data. Is that what's impacting on the children not being on track? Is it care experienced children that they're not on track? We have to find out just exactly what that is. And for those children who are on track, we still have to concentrate and focus on their learning needs. Now, if you're tracking conversations, pay lip service to the children that are on track and a huge focus is on the children that are not on track, then that's not an effective tracking conversation. We are not then addressing that national policy about raising attainment for all. So for the children who are on track, we still have to consider the gender balance there, or the gender imbalance there, or the SIMD, and so on in those lenses. Because while a child is on track today, tomorrow, the next day, if they are living in abject poverty, if they are SIMD, then at any moment that can become a barrier to their learning. So a concerted effort should be made around those children, our EAL learners who are on track, but never ever losing sight that that can be a barrier. To our boys that perhaps are doing well, but what we know internationally and nationally about our boys and in terms of reading, we still have to keep a very, very close eye and track their progress and in terms of how we support them. But of course, the conversation must also focus on how we are challenging those children. If you have primary 7 and you can see that they are overtaking lots of their second level benchmarks, then absolutely in that tracking conversation you look to third level. You see what elements of third level they can start to take over. And that's conversations that are key and that are quality around this story. Even having the conversation about children not having that glass ceiling and being able to overtake further levels from the benchmarks that we have. Also, what's key to the story is, and not so much becoming a greeting meeting, but some tracking conversations perhaps can be, but it's important we get an essence of the children in the class in terms of their health and well-being and their readiness to learn, especially as I've mentioned about attendance, but it could be around children's confidence and self-esteem and so on, that we have to be aware of those key elements and how we support children in their learning. So when you're telling the story, we're shifting from 63% on track for writing, 37% off track for writing. That's a fact. The story, actually, it's about making their writing more lively and interesting. That's the benchmark that they're falling down in, or that's what the assess piece is telling me from your data. Or there's a real lack of punctuation or sophisticated punctuation in their writing from the assess piece that we've just done. And out of those 37% off track for writing, they're all boys. They're all boys, and in actual fact, 3 out of those 37% are actually EAL learners. That's the story. That's the story that you tell. But the part we will move on to is about the so what, is about what you're going to do next. And in terms of where health and well-being and their readiness to learn comes in, it could very well be that, again, what we know from the international picture that thankfully that we are addressing, it can be about children's confidence and about their self-esteem, and that affecting their readiness to learn. So in terms of the story, tell the story that you have girls that are perhaps not as confident in your class and it's impacting on their attainment. And say, I think that they require some consolidation. Again, the shift from the fact, what perhaps your MALT or your diagnostic assessment told you about your class was, those girls, was that they are not attaining. That's the story. The shift then is to the action. What are we going to do about that? Okay, so now we consider the action, or the so what? So what about the facts? So what about that story that you can tell? Now we have to put that into action. So for those children that we have said are off track, what is it that the data and the story is telling us around those children? So we do know the facts, as we already discussed, 37% of children not on track for writing. Majority are boys. Some of them are EAL. What is the action then? We know that their writing's not as lively and as interesting as it could be. They're not using a range of sophisticated punctuation. So what's the action? The action perhaps should be around engaging those boys that are off track, the children off track, in high quality learning experiences. And that may be that perhaps we look to digital literacy to engage those learners. If we have EAL learners, perhaps it has to be more visual approaches. The story mapping support is what could be the intervention that we're going to put in place, the action to progress those children's learning. To those girls we mentioned around their confidence and self-esteem and their lack of attainment in numeracy, could be perhaps that we support them in very concrete materials approaches, as we have mentioned, that they get opportunities to consolidate, and perhaps they get opportunities to work more collaboratively to support each other in their learning. The action comes from the story. We know the things about why they're not on track, but then what's that targeted intervention? And again, as we said back at the very beginning, you're either off track or you're on track, and you will remain off track until we have that targeted intervention agreed as part of our tracking conversation, and only then can we say that they are, with support and with an intervention, will be on track. That has to be agreed. Okay, so how are we using? Again, back to the facts around the summative assessment, the diagnostic assessment, the assessment around the standardised approaches that we take, and how are we using them? And what we've not mentioned, because we know where they feature, those kind of assessments give us the facts, it tells us a wee bit about the story in terms of the gaps in our class, and then the action that we're going to take. But again, we must always return and be mindful of our benchmarks. And I'll speak a wee bit more about that when we look at what should happen in a tracking conversation in summary. The benchmarks are key and must feature in the action. We'll look to the benchmarks. We get all of that information from those summative assessments that inform our judgment, but the benchmarks are where we look to in terms of our assessment, but also in terms of where our children should be in their learning. Unless we get that robust plan, unless we're including all of the children, we will not progress children's learning. And we must ask ourselves, do we have that in terms of the off-track children, but also for the children that are on track? And again, as we said, are we looking to those benchmarks to progress the children's learning to see if they can overtake elements of the next level? And how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? And what I always say is that you should leave a tracking meeting. And for those who know me and for those who have been part of tracking meetings with me, you know we like to say you should leave your tracking meeting buzzing, because what you will leave with is a very clear and concise plan around the teaching and learning for your children. It will inform your forward plan. And that should appear there. It should be what drives the planning then from what you have agreed, that robust plan in your tracking meeting. We'll also share with you some effective tracking conversation videos that I made, and I must give a shout out to Alice, who's actually on this cohort with us, but also our colleague Claire from John Paul II Primary, and for Teresa, the principal teacher in St Thomas's Primary, who took part in those videos, and they'll give you some examples of just myself and those teachers talking through the fact, story, action process, and it'll give you perhaps a wee bit more of an insight into how that looks in real life. Okay, another key element that we're going to ask you to engage in is attainment over time, and to consider that. And some of those supports that you have in terms of comparator schools and the various databases and dashboards and toolkits that we have now gives us a wealth of tracking information that is around attainment over time. The video in particular with Teresa and I looks at how attainment over time should feature within an effective tracking meeting, and we urge you to go back to your schools to look at those various supports that you have in terms of comparator schools, and in particular attainment over time. They will also give you that information too, because they have been around for a number of years now, where you can track, if you have a primary 7 class, you can see where they were in terms of their attainment in primary 4, for example. And here's an example of a school where we would look to this and we would say, here's attainment over time. Here's a child's journey, or a class's journey rather, through their school career. And we'd be asking you to interpret this data in terms of their attainment over time. We would be asking you to look at this and to say, okay, primary 1, really very strong attainment there. However, at the next milestone for those children in primary 4 saw a very different picture. What can we attribute that to? What happened in that class from primary 4 to primary 5? There was obviously Mary Poppins in that class and worked wonders with those children, and for some reason their attainment has again steadied itself and increased. We would be looking to see what, in particular, we'd be looking to see who are those children. And you'll see in the video Teresa and I talking about specific children who had a targeted intervention but weren't making the progress that the other children in that targeted intervention group had, asking yourselves why. Those questions we ask you to consider. Go back to school, look and get this information about attainment over time, start to drill down, interrogate that data is what we're asking you to do. And it will be a journal task. We will send you out a task that will ask you to look with the same level of detail at your own class, and you will have that information there in your schools. And we ask you to record this in your journal, because it's the type of scrutiny that we ask, and again back to Higgius 4, that's asking us, until we interrogate and have that robust evidence-based data, we will not actually be progressing children's learning. We will not be putting the correct interventions in place unless we understand it. So another good exercise for you when you're considering, from this data that we have, the wealth of it, from these facts, how is this shaping my case study of improvement? Because your case study improvement must come directly from the data that you have in your schools and in your classrooms. Okay, now we ask you to consider tracking conversations and your roles and responsibilities in that. Do reflect on previous tracking conversations that you have had, and elements of them that have been particularly helpful, or elements that were perhaps less effective in supporting you and your considerations about progressing children's learning. However, fundamentally, it is your responsibility, and we ask that you take ownership for your own class data and that you go along fully prepared to engage in that professional dialogue with whoever it is you're having the tracking conversations with. Your professional judgment trumps everything. So all of that data, all of those facts, all of that evidence base is there to inform your professional judgment, and that is when we ask you to have all of the correct information that you need to be able to make informed judgments around your children's learning and how to progress your children's learning. So things to consider are all of those facts around your class, but fundamentally who is on track and who's off track. There is no in between. Now, there are many ways to track children's progress, traffic lights and other means to mark that and to track it. But the key starting point must be those who are off track and on track. There is no in between. And until we have a targeted intervention, until we have a robust plan around that for our children who are not on track, then we have to say that they are still off track. But with support, and then that intervention will become on track. Know your percentages of the children who are on track and off track. Know the percentages, the data of your class, of your gender, of your SIMD. Know all of those facts because it informs your story. Have those facts to your fingertips because, again, it's high-level messages that we get from that informs how we approach the teaching and learning and the planning for the high-quality learning experiences in our class. And again, when it comes to professional judgment, you are able to make informed and authentic prediction because it is from a very, very sound level, a very, very sound place in all that you've considered in terms of the data that you have. Can you identify the gaps in your class? So all of those toolkits and dashboards and things that we have in our authorities and local information about comparator schools are really very, very important in terms of identifying the gaps in our school. But we will be asking you for the gaps in your own class. That is something that must be part of your case study for improvement, that you've identified the gaps which has come from the data. The story is your interpretation of that so that you're able to say what your interventions are going to be and what those gaps are going to be, for example, in reading and writing and in numeracy and so on. That's important to have as part of the conversations in an effective tracking meeting. Okay, you're considering all of those other barriers, those lenses that we're looking through in the fact and in the story. Is it SIMD? Is it gender? Is it EAL? Is it attendance? And what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? If you know that it's SIMD, that you have a very, very clear approach as to how to consolidate and support those learners. Is it gender? What are you doing to engage your boys in areas of their learning that they're not attaining in? It's your responsibility and that's your action about what you're going to do. And in your case study for improvement, it's about what you're going to do differently. And who are those targeted intervention groups? Who? You're part of the selection of those, you're part of the plan for those. So be very aware of them, and that can evolve as part of a tracking conversation too. Always have your second Bible, which is your benchmarks, along with you. They must make up part of your tracking conversation and be able then to look to them, to be familiar with them, to reference them, to talk about children's progress, and also aware of levels and the areas that they can actually then start to overtake in other levels, and that's you then thinking about progress of your individuals, your groups and your class, and that will make you much more confident in your professional judgment. That's what's key to a tracking conversation, you going along and being very, very sure about the attainment in your class. I'm going to pass you now to Ailsa, who will be asking you then to think a wee bit more about your case study for improvement, and again referencing your ability to self-evaluate through all of these processes that Louise and I have mentioned, and to arrive at some kind of decisions and some idea about your improvement that you're going to make in your class.
Thanks, Geraldine. So considering all the different types of data that Geraldine has spoken about and that you will be starting to gather, this next section is going to get you to really start thinking about how you're going to use that data as part of a rationale for the focus of your case study of improvement, how you will begin to form a research question around this, and how thinking and writing evaluatively is going to be really important as you implement changes to your practice and measure the impact on learners. We spoke to you in webinar 1 about the key documents, with Higios 4 being one that we said was very important to you in your classroom and that journey of being truly self-evaluative. In particular, we'd like you to focus on Quality Indicator 2.3, which is Learning, Teaching and Assessment. This document here is your blueprint for highly effective learning, teaching and assessment, and we want you to become very familiar with its content. You'll see all the key learning and teaching concepts in IOC are mentioned in this, and that's for a very good reason, because if it's done effectively, they will raise attainment in your class. In order to be able to write evaluatively, we need you to start now on your journey of thinking evaluatively. So read the Level 5 illustration and the features of highly effective practice and consider your classroom. Start to look at the challenge questions and really think about your strengths and areas for development. True self-evaluation and using your data, as Geraldine has already taken you through, will help you to identify an area of improvement in your classroom and to form your research question. And I'll go on to speak about that more shortly. So when we're thinking about evaluative writing, and evaluative writing is something that you're going to have to do in your case study of improvement, it's important to make sure that we're consistently using the HMI professional language. So the words that are used here are used in the inspection process to describe numbers and proportions. And starting at the top, almost all means over 90%, most means 75 to 90%, majority means 50 to 74%, less than half means 15 to 49%, and few means up to 15%. So you can use these words within your case study of improvement when you're making statements to demonstrate the impact of the intervention that you've implemented. So, for example, you might say that from a baseline learner conversation, few children in the target group were able to name more than one reading strategy. And after the intervention, almost all were able to talk about 3 or more reading strategies that they used to help them. So that would show that difference and that change and that improvement for those particular learners. Sometimes you might wish to include the actual percentage after the evaluative word, particularly if it's at the higher or lower end of one of the categories. So for example, if you were talking about the majority of children and your actual percentage was 72%, that's pretty high up there. So you might write majority, brackets, 74% of children were able to, for example. It's really important that the evaluative statements are supported by robust evidence. So just be careful that if you're making a statement and you're saying most children, make sure that you can actually evidence that you mean 75 to 90%. And you might include some of this evidence within your appendices to back up those evaluative statements. So self-evaluation really is the starting point for thinking about forming a research question and choosing a focus for your improvement project. It's important to reflect on your own classroom, your own practice, what's working well, what's not working so well, reflecting against those standards within the Higios 4 document. Ask yourself the questions: what do I think would make a really big difference to my learners? What would I like to change or improve? When you've got a bit of an idea from your self-evaluation, then it's important to observe what's actually happening in the classroom at the moment. How are learners interacting and engaging with a particular area of the curriculum that you're thinking of focusing on? Really important as well to use your data. All of those different types of data that Geraldine talked about should be informing a rationale behind your improvement project. Conversations with colleagues as well could help you to start thinking of a focus. You might be talking about a whole school plan for improvement, or you might be thinking about something that's a particular focus for your stage in your school, and that might tie in with your improvement project. Professional reading as well. We've been signposting you to various pieces of professional reading throughout the programme. It might be something that you've read in there that's made you think, I could be doing that differently, I could improve that aspect of my practice. It could be a new teaching strategy, possibly one that your whole school is implementing, or you might be thinking about one of the aspects of learning and teaching that we're covering in the IOC webinars and looking at the impact that a real focus on improving one of those can have for learners. But really important is that whatever it is you choose for your improvement project, it needs to be meaningful, compelling and important to you. You have to be really invested in what you're doing and know that this is going to have a real benefit for your learners and your classroom. So when you have a bit of a better idea around what your focus might be, you can consider these aspects to decide whether your chosen focus is smart enough. So the first one is specific. So you need to be very specific about what you want to improve and who you want to involve. So for example, raising attainment in literacy or numeracy is too wide. Focusing on gathering data for the whole class is also too wide. So focus on a particular aspect, for example, multiplication strategies, or a particular aspect of comprehension in reading, and a specific target group of children for gathering your data. Measurable. So is it something that can be measured, whatever you've chosen? Can you use that triangulation of evidence to measure the impact of your intervention on whatever you've said it is that you want to improve? Consider the types of data that can be gathered to measure progress for that particular area. Is it achievable? So considering the resources and the time frame that you have available, are you going to be able to implement the changes to have the impact that you're hoping for? Is it realistic or relevant? So you need to be really realistic about what you want your intervention to achieve, again within that time frame, but also be really clear about why you are implementing a particular change or intervention and what the intended impact will be. Why is it relevant? Does the intervention match up well with the intended outcome? And as we've heard a few times today, you need to have a really strong rationale for your project based on self-evaluation, reflecting on different forms of data, as well as professional reading and research. And the last one there, time limited. You need to have a clear framework and timescale for the information that you're gathering. How long will you run a particular intervention? When do you expect to see the impact of that intervention? It's important to plan when you will need to gather different types of data throughout the project, throughout the process. So that's your baseline, interim and final data, which is going to inform your evaluation. All of that needs to be gathered within a strict time frame in order for you to have the time to evaluate and present the impact of that. Okay, so that really leads us into how do we actually form and word that research question. So a research question should be carefully framed and include the action or intervention that will be implemented and the intended outcome of the study being your case study of improvement in this case. And so as well as having the intervention and the intended outcome, we need to think about the who, the what, and the how. So who will experience the change, what will change, and how does it change? That's how you're going to include the intended outcome within your research question. Okay, so just to explain about what we mean by the who, the how, and the what. The who is the person that's going to experience the change, and in your case within IOC, this is going to be focused on the learners. So what is it that's going to change for the learners? Is it going to be their knowledge, understanding, skills, attitudes towards something, motivation? And then consider how that is going to change. So is it going to be increased awareness of something? Raised attainment, improved skills in a particular area. Once you're really clear about the who, the what, and the how, as well as your intervention, you can form that into a question. And so we're going to look at a few examples of those on the next slide. Okay, so I've color-coded a few examples for you here just to show you how, when you have a really clear focus on that who, what, how, and this specific intervention, this can be simply put into a research question. So the first one there, does active engagement in music making, that is the intervention, lead to improved phonological awareness skills? Phonological awareness skills are the what, and how do we want them to change? We want them to be improved, so that's your how. And the who, in this case, are a target group of learners in primary 1. Then a numeracy example, how does implementing a CPA approach and effective questioning, so there's two aspects to this particular intervention in blue there, lead to increased, that's how it's going to change, increased understanding of addition and subtraction strategies. And the understanding of addition and subtraction strategies is the what, and the increased is how that's going to change. And again, the who is specified as a target group of learners in primary 3. You might, if it's a specific learners that are SIMD 1 and 2 or a particular focus on EAL learners, you might also want to include that information here just to give us that really specific focus about the group, the who, that this intervention is intended to impact on. And then there's a couple of other examples there around reading and also writing for you to look at. So that brings us to the end of webinar 3. Thank you for listening to today's webinar. We'd like to remind you to tweet your thought of the day. So if there's anything from today's webinar that really resonated with you and has made you think about something in particular, if you can share that, that would be great. And we look forward to continuing with the post discussion back in Microsoft Teams now. Thank you.